On February 6th, President Trump signed an executive order imposing an additional 25% tariff on India, citing its support for Russia's war effort through the purchase of Russian oil. This brought the total U.S. tariff rate on India to 50%, landing it with the highest Trump tariff rate. Besides India, only Brazil faces a similar 50% rate, and even then, the U.S. has granted exemptions on multiple products, accounting for 44.6% of Brazil's total exports to the United States. It seems like just yesterday, at last year's Munich Security Conference, Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar was bragging in front of then Secretary of State Antony Blinken that India's scheme of importing Russian oil and reselling it to Europe for a profit was simply a smart move. All Blinken and his German counterpart could do was smile and nod. So how, in the blink of an eye, did India fall from a diplomatic master playing all sides to cannon fodder in the great power competition? India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, once said, "India cannot play a second-rate role in the world. It will either be a major influential power, or it will cease to matter." While this is an accurate assessment of the harsh realities of international politics, the problem is that India simply lacks the strength to back up its great power ambitions. The Indians themselves know their country's power can't compare to true superpowers like the US and the Soviet Union. But the Cold War rivalry between Washington and Moscow created an opening for them. At the time, national independence movements were surging around the world. Many nations, fresh from colonial rule and filled with national pride, were in no mood to simply find a new master. Individually, these newly independent nations were insignificant next to the superpowers, but there were enough of them that, united, even the US and USSR had to take them seriously. Nehru shrewdly seized this opportunity, joining with Yugoslavia's Tito and Egypt's Nasser to champion the cause of non-alignment. They adapted China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence to serve as the non-aligned movement's guiding doctrine. Thanks to this contribution and its considerable size among developing nations, India became a prominent leader of the movement, enjoying a moment of immense prestige. That all came crashing down with the 1962 Sino-Indian War. The conflict exposed India's hypocrisy, preaching peace to others while aggressively pursuing its own territorial claims, as well as its shameful display of abandoning its non-aligned principles to beg for help from both the US and the Soviet Union. After that, India's standing in the movement plummeted, and it could no longer act as the leader of the Third World on the international stage.
However, the war did make the US and the USSR notice India's potential as a counterweight to China. China had already established its great power status with its victory on the Korean Peninsula. The US opposed China ideologically, while the USSR had fallen out with it over conflicting national interests. Both feared China and wanted something to tie it down. India was large, had a conflict with China, and was willing to be pliable. It was the ideal pawn. As a result, both superpowers courted India, making it one of the rare countries during the Cold War that could receive aid from both sides without being forced to pick a team. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, India continued its masterful balancing act. On one hand, it used its conflict with China to become a key part of America's Indo-Pacific strategy, securing U.S. support. On the other, it joined the BRICS group, actively promoting a multipolar world and profiting from the anti-hegemony camp. It has to be said, India's diplomatic corps is genuinely skilled. They have masterfully leveraged their position as a regional power to secure enormous benefits for the country. This strategy reached its peak after the war in Ukraine. At a critical moment, when the West was imposing severe sanctions on Russia, India swooped in to buy discounted Russian oil and resell it to Europe for a massive profit. When European media confronted India's foreign minister about this at the Munich Security Conference, he defiantly stated that profiting from Russian oil was just India being smart. The Western officials in attendance could only smile and nod. After all, with the U.S. and its European allies bogged down in Ukraine and the Middle East, they were still counting on India to help contain China, and couldn't afford to alienate them. Besides, India's reselling of oil played a crucial role in stabilizing international prices, which was vital for Western economies struggling with stagnation and trying to avoid runaway inflation. At the same time, India was working alongside America's sworn enemies, China and Russia, to expand the BRICS group, increasing its global influence and reaping the rewards as a founding member. This ability to play all sides is something few nations possess. Many countries admired India's skill, and India itself was quite proud, believing it was skillfully manipulating the US, China, Russia, and Europe. But just 1 year later, this seemingly perfect diplomatic balance was shattered by Trump's tariffs. Before taking office, Trump had boasted that he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. Yet, 6 months into his presidency, the conflicts in both Ukraine and the Middle East were only intensifying. In his conversations with Putin, Putin offered plenty of emotional validation while actually using Trump's goodwill toward Russia to accelerate his military advances. Eventually, Trump realized he'd been played, but had few options. The Biden administration had already used most of the available leverage against Russia, and Trump's America First base meant he couldn't pour more American resources into a European war.
In this situation, Trump resorted to the big stick of secondary sanctions, threatening to force other countries to choose between trading with Russia or the U.S. On July 14th, in a complete reversal of his previous stance, he issued an ultimatum demanding Russia agree to a ceasefire within 50 days or face 100% tariffs and secondary sanctions. On July 28th, he shortened that deadline to 10 to 12 days. Russia's reaction was one of complete indifference. It had already weathered years of U.S. sanctions. Its trade with the U.S. was a minuscule $3.5 billion, an amount it could easily afford to lose. Besides, Russia could simply raise the prices of the essential goods the U.S. imports from it, forcing America to absorb the tariff costs itself. As for secondary sanctions, in today's deeply integrated global economy, who doesn't do business with Russia? Even the U.S. and its staunchest EU allies are major trading partners. And since Russia's biggest trading partner is China, the threat was empty. If the U.S. was going to levy tariffs on China for this, it would have done so during the first trade war. Events unfolded just as Russia predicted. As the ultimatum deadline approached, with Russia showing no signs of stopping, the U.S. found itself unwilling to tax Russia and not daring to tax China. But doing nothing was not an option. It would expose America as a paper tiger and further erode its authority. And so, the U.S. zeroed in on India, Russia's second-largest trading partner. Citing India's purchase of Russian oil as economic support for the war, Trump slapped on the extra 25% tariff. To justify this act of bullying, a weaker nation while avoiding a confrontation with China, the U.S. came up with a flimsy excuse. India was actively reselling oil to help Russia evade sanctions, whereas China was merely not participating in them. Obviously, few bought this explanation. India was furious, accusing the U.S. of betrayal. But the U.S. simply ignored India's outrage. The only reason America supported India in the first place was its potential as a counterweight to China. However, in a recent air battle, Pakistan scored a crushing 6-0 victory over India using Chinese-made export jets. This created a major problem for India's anti-China narrative. After all, if India can't even defeat a smaller Pakistan using non-top-tier Chinese weapons, how can it possibly challenge a larger and more technologically advanced China? Since India is useless in a confrontation with China, why should the U.S. continue to prop it up, especially when its own economy is in trouble? Wouldn't it be better to just devour India to restore its own strength? Ultimately, India's so-called brilliant diplomacy was nothing more than profiting from the gaps in great power competition. Its national strength is simply not sufficient for it to be a player, only a pawn. As long as the great powers maintained a state of competition without conflict, India could thrive by playing the middle. But as soon as the conflict intensifies and that middle ground shrinks, India gets squeezed, forced to pay the price for rashly joining a game far above its level.